On December 25, 1991, a red flag was lowered from the Kremlin for the final time. There was no invasion, no last stand, no foreign army at the gates. The Soviet Union, one of the most powerful states ever created, ended quietly in paperwork and silence. It did not fall because it was defeated in war. It fell because it tried to change itself. At the center of that change was one man who believed reform could save the system. Instead, it exposed everything holding it together. For most of the 20th century, the Soviet Union stood as a global superpower. It controlled Eastern Europe. It rivaled the United States in nuclear weapons. It governed nearly 300 million people across 11 time zones. From the outside, it appeared permanent. From the inside, it was deteriorating. The Soviet economy had stalled. Factories met production quotas, but produced goods that were outdated, inefficient, and unwanted. Innovation lagged far behind the West. Technology advanced slowly. Store shelves were often empty. Oil exports, one of the state's most important sources of revenue, were losing value. The centralized planned economy, once effective during rapid industrialization and war, could no longer adapt to a modern global market. But the deeper problem was political. The system survived on silence. Dissent was punished. Failure was hidden. Truth was treated as a threat. Citizens learned early that survival meant obedience. Speaking openly carried consequences. And pretending the system worked was often safer than admitting it didn't. By the early 1980s, even the leadership was failing. 3 Soviet leaders died in rapid succession. Power was concentrated among aging officials disconnected from everyday reality. The Soviet Union had become rigid, unable to reform, yet increasingly unable to function. Something had to change. In 1985, a new leader rose to power, Mikhail Gorbachev. He was younger than his predecessors, he spoke differently, and he believed the system could still be saved. Gorbachev did not intend to end communism. He believed socialism had been distorted by corruption, fear, and stagnation. If those flaws could be corrected, the system might survive. His answer came through reform. The first was economic restructuring, perestroika. State control would be loosened. Efficiency would replace blind obedience to quotas. Limited market mechanisms would be introduced to revive productivity. The second was political openness, Glasnost. Censorship was reduced. Journalists were allowed to investigate corruption. Citizens were encouraged to speak honestly about the country's problems. For the first time in decades, criticism was no longer immediately punished. At first, the reforms generated hope. People spoke openly in public. Newspapers printed stories once forbidden. The past, long buried, began to resurface. But openness had consequences no one fully anticipated. Once people were allowed to speak, they didn't stop. Accounts of Stalin's purges returned to public memory. Economic failures were openly discussed. Citizens compared their lives to those in the West and saw the gap clearly. Glasnost did more than reveal problems. It dismantled the illusion that the system was working. At the same time, perestroika struggled to deliver results. The reforms were incomplete. Too market-oriented for hardline communists, too controlled for real economic transformation. Prices rose, shortages worsened, living standards declined. Instead of renewal, daily life became more uncertain. Confidence in the state began to erode. People no longer feared speaking the truth, and once fear disappeared, loyalty weakened with it. By the late 1980s, the Soviet Union was no longer held together by belief, only habit. And that habit was breaking. Beyond Moscow, something even more dangerous was happening. Across the vast Soviet republics, long-suppressed identities were beginning to reawaken, and the center was losing its grip. As openness spread, nationalism followed. Across the Soviet republics, people began asking questions that had been suppressed for generations. Why were decisions made in Moscow? Why were local languages sidelined? Why should distant officials control their future? In the Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, calls for independence grew louder. These regions had been absorbed into the Soviet Union during World War II, and many never accepted Soviet rule as legitimate. Elsewhere, ethnic and regional tensions surfaced. In the Caucasus and Central Asia, disputes turned violent. The Soviet Union was no longer a single political body. It was a collection of identities pulling in different directions. The empire was beginning to fracture. Gorbachev faced an impossible choice. Previous Soviet leaders would have answered unrest with force, tanks, arrests. Silence restored through fear. Gorbachev chose a different path. He believed violence would destroy the legitimacy of reform. He believed the Union could survive only if it became voluntary. So he held back. When Eastern European states rejected communist rule, Soviet troops stayed in their barracks. When borders opened, they were not sealed shut again. In 1989, the consequences became unmistakable. Communist governments across Eastern Europe collapsed one by one. Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania. Then the Berlin Wall fell. The Iron Curtain, once enforced by force, disappeared almost overnight. The Soviet Union had just lost its empire abroad without firing a single shot. At home, pressure intensified. Hardliners inside the Communist Party saw reform as betrayal. They believed the state was unraveling because it had abandoned control. Reformers believed the opposite. They argued Gorbachev was moving too slowly, trapped between old structures and new realities. Meanwhile, the economy continued to deteriorate. Shortages worsened. Inflation rose. Public trust collapsed. By 1991, the Soviet government struggled to function at all. Then, in August, the breaking point arrived. A group of senior officials, party leaders, security chiefs, and military figures launched a coup. They placed Gorbachev under house arrest. They declared a state of emergency. Tanks rolled into Moscow. Their goal was simple: restore order, end reform, and save the Soviet Union by force. But the country they tried to seize no longer obeyed automatically. Thousands of civilians flooded the streets. Protesters stood in front of armored vehicles. Soldiers hesitated. Russian leader Boris Yeltsin climbed onto a tank and denounced the coup. Television broadcasts defied censorship. Orders were ignored. After 3 days, the coup collapsed. The hardliners had failed. But so had the Union. The Communist Party was discredited beyond repair. Central authority evaporated. Republics no longer waited for permission. One by one, they declared independence. The Soviet Union still existed on paper, but in reality, it was already gone. In December 1991, leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus met in secret. They signed an agreement dissolving the Soviet Union and creating a loose association in its place. Gorbachev was not consulted. Weeks later, he addressed the nation for the final time. He resigned as president of a country that no longer existed. That night, the Soviet flag was lowered from the Kremlin. The Russian tricolor was raised. An empire ended, not with war, but with resignation. The aftermath was brutal. The economy collapsed almost immediately. Savings vanished under hyperinflation. State industries failed. Life expectancy dropped sharply. Millions were pushed into poverty. The transition to capitalism was chaotic and unequal. Power shifted from the state to a small group of elites. Corruption flourished. Yet globally, the Cold War was over. The nuclear standoff that defined half a century ended without catastrophic war. Eastern Europe regained sovereignty. The world entered a new and uncertain era. The fall of the Soviet Union left a lasting lesson. Rigid systems resist change until change overwhelms them. Control can suppress truth, but it cannot erase it. And once openness is unleashed, it cannot be taken back. Gorbachev tried to save the Soviet Union by reforming it. The system could not survive the truth.